Artificial intelligence, or AI, can become a powerful force for the global goals. Join a panel of experts in the field reflecting on how achievements in AI relate to implementing the SDGs, how AI is supporting the COVID-19 response from health to economic recovery, and how to keep equitable AI progress on track to achieve the goals by 2030. The United Nations Deputy Secretary General is once again alongside Google and Alphabet CFO Ruth Porat. We hope to continue this annual AI check-in until the goals are achieved.
Dear Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to join this conversation on advancing the global goals with AI. The COVID-19 pandemic has killed nearly 1 million people, pushed tens of millions into poverty and hunger, and exacerbated inequalities along many dimensions. It has demonstrated the promise and power of technology to alleviate these grave impacts. It has highlighted disquieting issues of a lack of access and invasion of privacy. And it has demonstrated how vital it is for countries and societies to advance their technological capabilities and related policy capacities if they are not to be left behind. These are important considerations for us to keep in mind in relation to artificial intelligence as well. On the one hand, AI can enable faster progress on many of the Sustainable Development Goals through innovative solutions, more efficient resource use, and better decision-making through big data analytics. On the other hand, it can perpetuate bias and inequalities or even be used intentionally to violate human rights and develop applications that harm individuals and societies. Like many powerful technologies, artificial intelligence must be guided by human values, human solidarity, and human intelligence. We need to harness the full power of game-changing technologies like AI if we are to overcome the climate crisis and make a decisive break towards a new, more sustainable and equitable normal. At the same time, we must also counter its malign possibilities. Multi-stakeholder engagement, informed dialogue and capacity building, particularly in poorer countries, will be essential. That is also why the Secretary General, in his Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, expresses his intention to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory body on global artificial intelligence cooperation to address issues around inclusion, coordination, and capacity building. I'm encouraged that this meeting is contributing towards that end. I encourage the organizers of today's gathering to also explore collaborations with other platforms, such as the UN's Technology Facilitation Mechanism and its annual Global Science, Technology and Innovation Forum. Thank you for your engagement. I wish you all really productive discussions and look forward to hearing about the outcomes.
1 year ago, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed and I stood together on stage at the SDG Action Zone in New York. None of us could have predicted how dramatically our world would change over these last 12 months. As for many, at Google, this has been a time for rapid and bold action. In particular, we've been focused on enabling COVID response with our products and our platforms. We've amplified authoritative information. For example, we've seen over 1.3 billion search impressions for the World Health Organization and health authorities around the globe, powered by $250 million in ad grants. And we've supported small businesses disrupted by the pandemic with virtual training and tools from our Grow with Google team. Importantly, COVID has reinforced our commitment to areas where we've been hard at work, areas which support progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, we recently announced that Google intends to be the first major company to operate entirely carbon-free by 2030. We know this is an audacious goal, but we believe audacious goals can catalyze systemic change. In the same vein, we previously announced a record-breaking ESG bond issuance that we believe can support the expansion of a new asset class to support key sustainability efforts. During our time together last year, I talked about how AI could support the global goals. So today I want to share 2 concrete examples of AI in action during the last 12 months. First, we continue to make progress with respect to flood forecasting in India. Partnering with the Indian government, we've developed accurate and timely AI-powered flood forecasts, which are now available across the country. In our pilot, some alerts reached village leaders days in advance of traditional systems. This timely, data-intensive prediction models are helping to fight one of the leading causes of natural disaster deaths. Second, we're focused on air quality monitoring in Uganda. Last year, in the Action Zone, we heard about Makerere University's work to build low-cost air sensors. Now installed around Kampala, these sensors provide real-time data AI systems that can predict local pollution. The predictive data is being shared with citizens to inform their daily choices and with government to inform policy. These examples show how responsible, cooperative development can make a difference for the most vulnerable populations. And while we celebrate progress, we also remain clear-eyed about the new risks and ongoing need for coordination. Responsible development and implementation are key to harnessing AI's capacity, which is in part why Google established AI principles in 2018 to guide our development and use of AI. And on an ongoing basis, we have created internal processes to align research, product, and business decisions with the principles. Now is the time to move from a conversation about the potential of AI to a conversation about the impact it has and can unlock. Together, we must work to ensure that AI is developed and used appropriately, and that it delivers real benefits to users and communities on the ground. Resources like the UN's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation and discussions like the one you're about to hear today are vital in guiding how businesses, civil society, and governments can work together. I would like to thank and congratulate the UN, the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General for their continued leadership on the SDGs and their commitment to creating the SDG Action Zone as a place for us to have these important conversations. Today, you'll hear from my colleague, Kent Walker, who is Google's Senior Vice President for Global Affairs, UN Under-Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, and a number of Google.org grantees about how AI is advancing progress on the global goals and the collaboration that is critical for these efforts. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kent Walker. I lead Global Affairs at Google. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to kick off our conversation with a few words to set up the discussion. The past year has shown us very clearly the importance and the urgency of advancing progress on the global goals. And we know that artificial intelligence, which already powers so much of our daily lives, from filtering spam to finding the fastest way home, can help us make unprecedented progress, not just on those issues, but on some of our most vexing humanitarian and environmental challenges. But we also know that that progress will take more than just the right tools. We'll need both collaboration and responsible innovation. First, let me talk for a moment about collaboration. We all share the UN's belief that innovative tools, especially AI and advanced technologies like quantum, can help us achieve the goals. But it's going to be rare that any organization acting alone is going to be positioned to take an idea all the way from conception to impact. Change results from bringing together technology and domain experts to work on an important problem using robust data. A couple of examples. For example, Google.org's grantee WattTime set out to build a model to estimate global power plant emissions using satellite imagery, clearly an important problem to solve. They quickly realized that the potential benefits to citizens and policymakers that would come from bringing together organizations tracking other types of emissions, like those from farming and shipping, would be essential. So they've launched Climate Trace, a consortium of 9 different partners who will be the world's first global independent source of robust data on greenhouse gas emissions. Another example is the Lacuna Fund, co-founded earlier this year by Google.org, which aims to unify aid organizations and private philanthropy to fund high-impact data that unlocks AI's potential for equitable impact. Our panelist, Vukosi, Marivate, will share more about their work. The UN's Roadmap for Global Cooperation can help us chart a path toward this kind of collaboration and achieving goals. But while cooperation is essential to moving forward on this work, it's also not enough. We also need responsible innovation, because like any transformative technology, the virtue of AI is not inherent. It raises important challenges that we have to address thoughtfully. In the 2 years since Google released our own AI principles, the ethical charter that guides our work in this area. We've integrated those principles into the fabric of our business. We're learning more every day, including from our grantees and our partners, and we're committed to sharing tools, processes, and learnings with the global community. So let me transition to the panel to get their perspectives on these issues. We know that AI and other emerging technologies have the potential to improve billions of lives. As my colleague Ruth said earlier, we're excited to be moving from a conversation about the potential impact of AI to a discussion about the actual impact it's already having. So for that discussion, I'm honored to be joined today by an impressive panel of leaders who will share their experiences in actually working to implement AI in service of the global goals. Thanks to each of you for joining us. We're eager to hear from you about the work you're doing, the collaboration that enables it, and the challenges you're facing. So I'd ask you each to please share a brief introduction to yourself and your work, and since we're all not together in New York this year, where you're joining us from today. Let's start with you, Mr. Undersecretary General. And I believe you're on mute.
A very good morning to you all, or good afternoon, depending which time zone you're in. It's a great pleasure, and I'd like to thank Google for convening us. My name is Fabrizio. I'm a long-serving United Nations staff member, and now I'm leading the work on behalf of the Secretary General in the area of positioning the organization to be of better use to member states and other stakeholders to steer digital technologies to maximize their benefits for development and to curtail their harms.
Whoever wants to jump in next.
Hi, my name is Clara Nordon. I'm calling from Bordeaux, France. I'm the director of the MSF Foundation, which is an entity created by Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, to fostering innovation. So we incubated a project called AntibioGo in the context of a rising antimicrobial resistance, AMR. As you know, AMR has become one of the biggest threats to global health and endangers other major priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our app uses image processing and AI to help non-expert laboratory technicians to interpret tests that measures resistance to antibiotics. Those tests are crucial to guide clinicians on selecting the best course of treatment and avoid antibiotic misuse. Thank you.
Vukosi?
Good day. I'm Dr. Vukosi Marivate. I'm the ABSA Chair of Data Science at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. I run a research group called the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group, which looks at problems that are in the intersections of data science for society, as well as natural language processing. And given those two spheres, I'm one of the co-founders of the Deep Learning Indaba, which is one of the largest grassroots-driven machine learning or AI communities in the world that was started here on the African continent, as well as one of the steering committee members for the Lacuna Fund, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
Great. And Pablo?
Hi, yes. Thanks for this. And I'm Pablo Fernandez. I'm from Chequeado in Argentina. We are the first fact checker in the region. This year is our 10th anniversary. We are celebrating in the pandemic, but this is our 10th anniversary. And we are part of this panel because we are working with Full Fact in the UK, Africa Check, that is working in different countries in Africa, and the ODI to develop an automation tool to tackle misinformation. We have been working together thanks to Google, and we have been working also in automation since 3 years ago. So it's something that we are developing for a long time, but also it's something that is working. That is something that you said before. It's something that is very important for us because it's something that we are using to tackle misinformation right now in the middle of the pandemic.
Vukosi, and then Pablo, let me start with you and pick up on those themes. As we know, working to achieve the goals is going to take organizations working across boundaries, both international boundaries and organizational boundaries, as well as continued leadership from the UN. You're both part of international collaboratives. What can we learn from your experiences? Vukosi?
Yes. just giving an example from where we started as the kind of the deep learning in Daba, that was a collaboration between researchers across different institutions and also across actually different continents, not just the African continent, but also Africans in the diaspora, who identified that we know that AI and machine learning is going to be transformative. How do we make sure that Africans actually become active contributors and shapers of these technologies that are coming? And at the same time, we know that data is an important component of this work. And as such, you need to bring in people from different spheres who can come in and look at ways that we can actually build this community together. So those collaborations have gone on and they've spun off over since 2017 over that. One project I can highlight that has come out of this is the Masakani project, which aims to build on African natural language processing, where now we have researchers that are spread across the African continent, working together to find innovative ways to collect data, find ways to build benchmarks in languages on the African continent in such a way that they also can be counted in the way we look at how AI has actually disrupted these type of areas. And as such, that's why it's kind of natural then sitting on the Lacuna Fund, thinking about how then we actually expand how data acts as one of the pillars to try and bring more participation and equity when we think about AI's future on internationally, not just in the African continent.
That's fantastic. Pablo, how does that compare with your experience?
Yeah, we are working in 3 different continents, and that is why it's so important to know what you have in common. There is a lot, because we are fact checkers working to tackle misinformation, but we also have a lot of difference. When we are talking about infrastructure, it's not the same how we deal with open data in the UK, in South Africa, or in Argentina. So it's something that we care a lot about, how to find what we have, where we have difference, and try to find how we can combine these things. Because just to give you an example, we work with claims. So we have to find claims that maybe a politician has said. And I don't know, in the UK, our colleagues in full fact, they have like the BBC using subtitles every day. And that is not the case in South Africa or in Argentina. So we have to use speak-to-text recognition in some way that is not exactly the same. So, and as we are trying to create this tool for not only for the organizations in this team, but also for all the fact checkers in the world, is something that we have to keep in mind. The differences and how can we tackle that problems, because we want this tool to be useful not only for the countries that have maybe the best access to open data or to subtitles or to claims, but for everyone. So that is something that we keep in mind all the time.
Two both very important ways of assuring high quality data available broadly to everybody. Mm-hmm. Fabrizio, let me step back. How do you see the role of the United Nations in harnessing the power of AI to achieve the development goals?
First, we have to acknowledge that the Sustainable Development Goals have suffered a major backward step due to COVID. Inequality in virtually every area has grown. I saw an estimate from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that there are 37 million new poor. So for the first time in decades, development indices have dropped. And there's no way that we're going to manage the catch-up. There's no way we're going to achieve the goals without making much better use of digital technologies and AI in particular. And as you indicated, AI has no inherent virtue. Some would suggest, and I'll come back to that it may even, left unattended to, tend more to be useful for pernicious ends than positive ends. So it needs a steer. And we've seen how it can be used for good. We've seen predictive analytics undertaken by our colleagues in the humanitarian sphere in the UN. For the first time, thanks to AI tools that have helped with predictive analytics, we've dispersed funds for famine prevention in Somalia and in Bangladesh at early onsets of the threat of famine. That's never been done before. And that's obviously far more cost effective and a much better resource of use of resources than afterwards. We've seen in the COVID response how AI prediction and identification of case clusters allows for a much more rapid response and allows for maintaining the freedom of movement of others outside those clusters. So AI tools and digital tools have been absolutely life-saving when it comes to the COVID response. But we've also seen how AI-driven algorithms have greatly boosted on social media the distribution of misinformation, of false information that has led to loss of life and hospitalizations. So COVID has very much illustrated both the tremendous potential for positive uses, but also the negative effects. And the bottom line is we need a better global steer. And there the UN has proposed that we should establish a platform where member states, private sector companies, civil society could come together and share best practices. I mean, we see a huge elaboration of principles for AI in the private sector, among academics and individual member states. What is happening insufficiently is a sharing of those principles, is a sharing of best practices, is a sharing of practices to curtail the harms. I would just highlight, 20 years or 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. Some say the East Germany came to an end because the state of East Germany was overwhelmed by the data it collected on its individual citizens. Literally tens of thousands of kilometers of files that it could just no longer process. It didn't know what to do with all the spying data it had on its own people. Today, with AI, East Germany would not have that problem, and it might still exist. So we also need to be mindful not only of the impact of AI for development, but also for human rights, and ensure that we build in adequate safeguards. And that's where we believe the sort of platform the Secretary General wants to put in place to share best practices but for the use of a technology which by definition ignores borders would be particularly valuable.
So your themes of healthcare and ensuring high quality content, trustworthy content online are actually a great segue to some of the work that Clara and Pablo have been doing. Clara, could you perhaps start off by talking a little bit about how MSF is delivering responsible solutions, both in the development and the implementation, that incorporate the perspectives of shareholders and the communities that are affected by your work?
Sure. AI is relatively new, but we could also rely on existing principles that aren't. AI or not, we are dealing with health data. So we didn't start from a blank page here. We followed the same health data protection policies and with any other project within MSF. Then we are by design a medical device. So here again, there are pre-existing regulatory framework. We are actually under the certification process of the European Union directive, and this is strong guidance. But I agree some concepts still need to be refined, mainly because AI product development implies cross-sectorial collaboration. And in our case, before rolling out live, we wanted for AntiBioGo to be robustly evaluated to prove it's effective and safe. So to guide us in this, we took part of the ITU WHO focus group called AI for Health. And mainly this group works to establish a standardized assessment framework by discussing different methodology, peer reviewing, etc. So one step is rely on pre-existing regulatory framework. And the second is for the unframed yet, engage in collaborative, open, cross-sectorial discussions that still work in progress.
So it sounds like these frameworks, whether best practice sharing or trading information, are a key part of what you're doing. Pablo, on your side, how are you bringing the perspective of the community in and making sure you're developing these tools in responsible ways?
Yeah, we know that we are working with misinformation, against misinformation. So it's key to be humble and try to find the ways to at least in our end, we try to be non-partisan. So we have to fight against misinformation in both sides of the parties. And also, and this is very important, I have been talking about free fact-checking organizations, and we are like the biggest in size, or one of the biggest in size in the world, and we are between 20 and 30 people, the whole organization. So usually fact-checking organizations are not huge, so we also have to pay attention also to if our colleagues has engineers in-house. Usually they don't have, so we have to build tools that are useful for them, but also kind of out of the box in some way. So we have to think before on how this can be implemented in other countries and what they need to think about. If, I don't know, will they be able to gather information from their media outlets? Will they be able to access open data from their governments? So we have to have like a universal approach to this, and we have like a transnational team for this, but it's something that we keep in mind all the time. And at the same time, in some ways, we have to work also with the governments trying to open data. But at the same time, we are fact-checking that government. So it's like a balance in that area that we try to keep is part of our goal.
And so sometimes there's a problem of too much bad information. Sometimes there's a problem of not enough good information. Vukosi, can you share some insights about how the Lacuna Fund is focusing on the role of relevant, high-quality data in AI solutions for the global goals?
Yeah, I think I'll first pick up on Mr. Undersecretary General's point, especially on COVID-19. One of the things we need to understand is sometimes the relevant data or information is missing, and we've seen this and had to experience this during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? On one side, sure, it's about information that's made available online, but then at the same time, as we're fighting this pandemic, my research group and myself worked on finding ways to open up as much data about COVID-19 in South Africa as possible, because they want just these open data portals. If you're going to do any modeling, whether it's AI, statistics, mathematics, you need to have this data being available. And that's where we find ourselves, that the basics, if the frameworks aren't there, then it's very hard to ask, a lot out of these things. So in recognition of such gaps, you then need to build also the same foundations for artificial intelligence. And the Lacuna Fund sits in a point where it can look at a couple of very promising areas whereby if we had more inclusive data or data that was coming in from the global south, there could then be new innovations that come along. If, for example, I'll go back to my love of my research area in local language. We need more ways in such a way that people actually can interact with the internet. We tend to think it's democratic, but then it's mostly, for most people, monolingual. And the way that it becomes more multilingual has been with the introduction of tools that can allow translation, can allow tagging, and can also allow interactions. I think Pablo talked about doing text-to-speech. For most of the world's languages, these technologies aren't there, right? So you need to first actually collect the data, build the AI on there, and then that's when you can actually improve on these things. So you then see that we really want to get to a point where we can also just have data about about us without us, right? We need to then make sure that also the people who then have these technologies being that they're using them also are people who can shape their futures, whether it's through policy, it's also technical, that they have a subset who can work in R&D within their local areas and actually choose where the future of AI will be.
And Clara, even when data is available and we've done the work to make sure there's community buy-in, there can still be a distance between a working application in theory and actual adoption in the field. Are there lessons from your work on Anti-BioGo that are helpful here?
Yeah, I say those are kind of normal and pragmatic adjustment between what you're working on and what you finally decide to implement. And with NDBio Go, we are basically trying to read and interpret what's on a Petri dish, but we also set a primary goal to avoid the black box effects and want it for our users to be better at this test after using the app than before. So an example, for part of the Petri dish reading, AI was very powerful, reading labels, name, measuring disk diffusion. And for another features, like the pattern recognition of resistance mechanism, we observe a fairly good performance as well. But ultimately, we decided that we'd rather show the user example and ask him to select the correct mechanism out of a list by himself rather than using the automatic detection, only for pedagogical impact. So sometimes by breathing, rethinking, and asking the correct question, we realize that even when performance rate is high, AI is not always the best answer.
There's a value to humility sometimes in these things. So let me ask Fabrizio. We've heard about the challenges of gathering the right data, minimizing the bad data, making sure that we're responsible in innovation. Despite those challenges, how do you think AI will affect our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
I think that depends on how well it's steered. I think AI has tremendous potential, especially in health, to leapfrog progress, to allow the poorest of the poor to access and have much more targeted, better, fine-tuned access to treatment, along the lines of the great work that MSF is doing. I think in detecting weather patterns and ensuring that there's adequate mitigation for climate, the impact of climate change and environmental destruction, AI can play a major role. It can also, where we choose to believe in the science, help detect exactly the level of damage we're doing in real time. I think it can do predictive analysis of where hunger is going to strike. It can help facilitate better access to education. So in so many areas, it can help us overcome inequalities, overcome divides, and help us move more in a more sustainable way to the implementation of development opportunities for those who need it most. But it can also undermine human rights, and it is being used to undermine human rights and exercise control. And it can also be used to fuel polarization and division, nurture hate speech, and create disinformation and weaponize social media in ways that undermine our democracies and undermine social cohesion. And it can also boost inequality. I mean, the AI now is, I think 70% of patents are in just 2 countries. The processing of the data can be drawn from all over, but it's basically being owned and used in just 2 or 3 places. So what does that mean for those who need it most? So the bottom line is we need much greater steerage, and that greater steerage has to come as much from governments who are desperately trying to play catch up with a technology that's spreading at the speed that humanity has never known with any previous technology, but also above all the private sector who's at the forefront, also unlike previous technologies, with the impact of this new technology. And we need innovative ways to manage these technologies so that they really do bolster the implementation of the SDGs and don't leave us 10, 15 years from now less safe, with our human rights undermined and more unequal. And if things are just left to drift, if we rely on the sort of laissez-faire approach that has sort of dominated so far, and if we rely on the famous invisible hand of the market, I'm not sure what we leave behind for future generations will be so great. So I think the urgency now is really to get together across government, across international policymakers, across business, across civil society, to provide greater steerage and really fulfill the promise and curtail the peril.
We are seeing unprecedented efforts, I know, both at the UN and with national and regional governments, as well as in the private sector and groups like the Partnership on AI, to make sure that these initiatives are moving in the right direction. Let me end by asking our three NGO panelists where they see causes for optimism, new areas for potential research in AI that we're not exploring now, new ways we could use these tools to help advance progress toward the goals. Let me start with Pablo.
Yeah, first, we are optimistic in the way that, of course, as we have been discussing, there's a lot of things that we have to take care of to move in a good way. But also we are now optimistic because, I don't know, even 2 or 3 years ago, there was much less material available to use in Spanish. And we are talking about a huge language with a lot of speaking people. So as we discussed before, for us it's important to have tools that other languages can use, that people from other countries can use. So as we have been discussing, the idea of having AI tools, when we are talking about tools, we are talking about the pieces that make the machine work, about the AI works. And we are happy that right now the speak-to-text is working kind of good in Spanish, but even 2 years ago, it wasn't the case at all. So we think that it's accelerating a lot, and that is something that we care a lot about. And also, we think that we have to pay attention as how can we develop other languages and AI in different countries, because it's very important to not lose track in some way of what is happening. We are trying to do this in Argentina, in the UK, and in Africa Czech, in different countries in Africa. But it's very important to keep this in the agenda in the whole world.
Right. Clara, let's turn to you. Reasons for optimism, new areas for exploration, where can AI be most helpful?
To the risk of repeating Mr. Undersecretary General, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I see in AI a real potential to close gaps. I mean, you can turn a smartphone into a medical device, potentially. So zero supply chain, almost zero marginal costs. Like for antibiogo, you can enable certain diagnostic by covering gap in expert human resources. Very exciting. But for those benefits to reach everyone, we have to keep attention on also prioritizing pathologies with the highest death burden in the field, focus on health issues lacking attention from the commercial health sector, to focus on accessible sources of data, available imaging material, not only CT scans. And finally, we have to keep challenging existing solutions coming out every day when we witness socio-demographic bias. There is a risk already observed that the data set to build actual models do not include multiple geographic origins. And the result is that they may perform very well, but only for a certain group of population. So if we're not vigilant, AI might also increase health inequality. So that's why I think we're really at a turning point.
Yes, it's a critical moment. And Vukosi, let's give you the last word. What are you most excited about?
Thank you there. I think taking again a little bit from Fabrizio, it's understanding that there's a lot of energy. For me, over the last 5 years or so on the African continent, it's been really exciting to see how young people have been really at the forefront of pushing where AI might go, and in terms of this question of steering, right? Because we are really concerned that you don't want to have technologies that also are just exploitative. So you have, for us, finding new ways that we can collaborate, finding new ways that we can build a strong research and development community that then can also imbue our own values in these technologies as they come into our areas is very important. Through the Deep Learning Indaba, we've also influenced having Kipu start in South America. We've seen also other communities start in East Asia. And this is very important for really the global spread. Sure, we might not have the same money that very big nations have or big organizations have, but we do have the people and we do have the will in this case. And we are working towards really being in those rooms, like punching above your weight, that you are sitting in with statesmen and talking and explaining, right? For me, one of the things I hate is people saying it's complicated, so it can't be explained. We do need to have our ministers understanding what these technologies are, also knowing how to actually ask the right questions when now we're talking about implementation in such a way that we, at the end of the day, we are all better off.
It's a great note, and hopefully this discussion has been one step in that direction. Let me thank everybody who's joined us today, and most especially our panelists for everything you're doing to accelerate the progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. It's clear that AI has equipped us to tackle urgent challenges, and in some ways, the biggest risk may be failing to tap its potential. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the urgent need for it to be developed in a responsible way that benefits everyone and help us all work together toward the goals. Thank you all very much for your time today.